Guys, I am super excited to be in Indianapolis. I get a chance to speak a lot of places, and I don't get a chance to speak a lot in Indianapolis, so it's really cool to be here today. Today, we're talking about secrets of the obsessed, lessons from the guests that I have had on the podcast. First of all, I feel like I should give you a couple of disclaimers, and I feel kind of bad about this. So, when I write a talk, typically I will come up with the title of the talk, and then I'll see if the talk gets accepted, and then I'll write the talk. So I submitted this idea, and frankly, after I got accepted, I was like, I need to Google my title to see what Poppy said I was talking about, because I don't remember what I told her. So I Googled Secrets of the Obsessed, and I found this book called Secrets of the Obsessed. So if you were expecting to hear from Pamela Antoinette, PhD today, you may be sorely mistaken because she's not here. It's just me. And sorry, Pamela, I didn't mean to rip off your title. Disclaimer number two, I've had 120 different guests on Obsessed shows so far, and I'm only featuring a handful of them. So if you have a favorite guest or a favorite interview that you've heard, or you've never heard the show before and you're expecting to hear from a particular person, we're only featuring a couple of them. And so I hope I hit some of the favorite ones, but there are a lot of great quotes and a lot of great interviews on there. So I hope I hit some of your faves. One of the questions that I got really early on is, why would you start a podcast? Like, why take the time? Are you making any money on this? No. Like, why would you do this? And the reality is, these are questions that I wanted to ask these guys, these amazing men and women and designers of all different fields, and literally having the chance to talk to some of the most creative people in the world, especially at the time when I was growing my business. Selfishly, I wanted to have these conversations, and I thought it would be really cool to be able to share them with everyone. So for any of you who've listened before, you may hear common themes within the show. The question and format kind of stays the same. So I have a very similar framework, similar questions, but it's amazing how differently those conversations turn out, even though we're asking a lot of the same questions. So a lot of the secrets that I'm going to share with you today are from some of my favorite questions. My favorite place to start with these interviews is with origin stories. And it's always fascinating to me to hear kind of how somebody got introduced to design or into a creative field in the first place. And while this first secret has a lot to do with one of our guests, it has just as much to do with my origin story of being in a place to have these conversations. And it's secret number one is that famous designers are just people. They're really not that scary. And the way that I found this out actually was from guests on episode number 24, which was recorded in 2016. But I actually had a chance to meet Michael Beirut back in 2001. Now, young Josh was an art director in his first ad agency role of a now defunct agency called Concepts Marketing Group. And I got voluntold to help out with the AIGA. And so I had gone to Portfolio Day, and I've gone to a couple events. I was loosely on the board, really just kind of in a volunteer slot. I knew who Paula Scher was. I knew who Pentagram was. But honestly, I don't think I had a very good idea of who Michael Beirut was or how important his work was until I got to his talk. So I volunteered to help out. He was on stage, delivered an amazing talk. And afterwards, the board said, hey, a couple of us are going to take Michael to dinner. We're going to go grab some steak. Do you want to come with us? And of course, our amazing board full of introvert designers sat at one end of the table, and Michael was at the other end. And I ended up as the last one at the table sitting right next to him, and I talked his ear off. And the thing that I was struck by was, one, I was learning from Michael from the first at his talk, but I had a ton of follow-up questions. So how did you sell that? How did you price that? How did you meet that client in the first place? Why do you think they came to you? And I probably asked him 1,000 questions. And he was probably like, I just want to try my steak here. I've never had a moment by myself since I've been here, but I just chatted his ear off. But the thing that I was most struck by is Michael Beirut, who many people will say is among the most famous designers in the world, was just a guy from the Midwest. And when you sit down with him for steak dinner, he was just as easy to talk to as anybody else. So especially as some of you young designers in the room are thinking about, like, man, I wish I could go work in some agency. I wish I could go work in a different market. I'd love to go work for this really famous firm. They're just people. Just reach out and make the connection. Another question I like to ask is red flags. And for me, it was about identifying, okay, before you get into a bad relationship with a client or one that's even just not a good fit, what do you look out for in the first place? So secret number 2 is that a designer's job is to teach clients first how to see. And I learned this one from Paula Scher, who's also from Pentagram, and I promise that's the extent of the Pentagram examples in today's talk. But Paula said she begins everything with identity, because from her vantage point as an identity designer, that's how you learn to design all the other pieces and look how it all goes together. But she can tell in that very first presentation that if, as she's presenting and she's asking clients for feedback and asking them to come alongside of one of the things that she's recommending, and they don't even know how to respond to her, they don't know how to answer her questions, she understands that she has not done her job right. So again, your job as a designer is to first teach that client how to see, how to look at your work, how to judge your work, and how to respond to it. Another question that I love to ask our guests is, what's your best piece of advice? Either your favorite piece of advice that you have received from a mentor or your favorite piece of advice to pass along to a young designer. Secret number 3 is you get the work you show. So again, back in the Wayback Machine of Josh as a young design student, I had a chance to visit CVR while I was a senior at Purdue. And I met with a guy named John Malloy, who was an art director there at the time. I don't know if any of you know John, but we were flipping through my ridiculously massive plastic portfolio at the time, and we got to the billboard that I did in my internship. I was so proud of this billboard. I had the art printed out all large, and then I had an actual printed Kodak photograph of the real billboard in space sitting there. And he was like, "So did you do the logo?" I said, "No, but I did this billboard. Did you see this billboard?" And he said, "Did you design the identity?" No. "Did you take the photograph?" No. "Did you write the headline?" No. I just, I put the pieces together, but I did the billboard. It's a real billboard." And he said, "Is this the kind of work that you want to do?" And I said, I guess not." And he said, "Then don't put it in your portfolio," which relates to this story from Von Glitchka. So he was meeting with a friend of his named Craig Fraser, who's a well-known illustrator. And he knew Craig's work. He knew Craig personally. But Craig had created this piece for a conference they were at with a particular style of illustration. And Von's flipping through it, and he goes to the first page, and he says, "Craig, I've never seen this one before. Who's this for?" And he said, I just did that for myself." And he goes to the next page, and he said, "I don't think I've seen this one either." And he's like, yeah, I just got this idea and wanted to do that one." And he goes to the third page, and he's like, "And this one?" And he was like, "Listen, Von, you get the work you show. I'm not just showing work that's client work because it's what I wanted to show because the client paid me to do it. I'm only showing the kind of work that I want to do. And I know that if I show this work, it's going to bring that kind of work in." Another thing I was always curious about is, how do you land your dream client? It turns out your dream client might be waiting for you to call. That's secret number 4 that I learned from Robin Ray from Modern Dog. Now, if you Google Robin Ray and Modern Dog, or listen to this episode number 11, there's an amazing story about a copyright battle that she won. That's not what we're talking about today, but you should go check that out. Robin's firm became famous for all the work that they did early on in the mid-'80s for K2 snowboards when that brand was just launching. And that became some enviable client that all kinds of other agencies wanted to go work for. The reality was she happened to meet a guy who worked there at a party, and then later the next week she thought, he didn't exactly say to call, but I'm going to call and tell the receptionist that he told me to, and then see if I can get a meeting. So she gets a meeting with the marketing director, not the guy that she had met, and he said, "I have been waiting for you guys to call me." Well, not exactly. It turns out there was another firm in town called MD Design or something, and he thought she was them. They ended up landing this client and doing work for them for years for a client that would define their portfolio just because she had the nerve to call. What about growing your business? This is a question I got about halfway through doing the show, and a user from Twitter was saying, "Hey, next time you get people on, ask them about why they have grown their business to the size they have, why they've kept it small, why they've taken it large, and what we should do. And I learned secret number 5 is it's okay to be small. Any of you know this guy? Aaron Draplin from the DDC is still the most downloaded episode of Obsessed Show ever, weighing in about twice as many episodes as my next closest download. But he talked about how his passion for the work and how much he loves being involved in all the details, and how his friends look at him funny because when it's time to go do something else, he just wants to do more design. He has so intentionally kept his agency small because he had worked another place that was in growth mode. And you get to the point where you hire extra people, and then you're looking at those extra people going, well, yesterday I only had one job, and now I got to figure out what to make this guy do. And then the next day you've got 3 more people, and how do you keep them busy? So nothing against growth. Growth can be an awesome thing, but the point is it's okay to stay small. So if you want your practice to be small and you want to be hands-on with your clients, works for Aaron Draplin, might work for you. What about getting stuck? The one indie designer that I'm featuring in the talk today, Anna Saraceno, taught me the importance of going to talk to someone. I would ask all of you to raise your hand if you consider yourself an introvert, but I think that might not work so well for us. Anna's a remote worker for Trello. She's the senior product designer, and she's here in Indianapolis. Like, who knew that Indiana was home to 2 folks from Trello, a really cool productivity software. But Anna learned that when she would get stuck on a project, that the best thing for her to do, especially as a remote worker, was not to get online and ask her coworkers, but actually to take it to somebody who doesn't know what she's doing, who isn't a designer, who isn't necessarily coming at this with all the baggage of the project, but really just to go talk to somebody in person. So extra challenging for someone who's maybe introverted and remote to do that. But it's a good encouragement to get out of your comfort zone and go talk to real people about your work. This is always sort of a joke question. So I always ask people, what's a typical day or a typical week look like? And I can almost guarantee you that everyone's response is going to be, well, I don't really have a typical week because it's always different. However, lesson number 7 is during your week that is never typical, make time for yourself for personal projects. This recommendation in particular came from Tad Carpenter of Carpenter Collective. Now, I had just seen Tad present at Creative South, which is an awesome conference. If any of you have not been to that one in particular, I didn't meet Tad there. I don't know him personally, but when you listen back to this episode, it's amazing how warm and inviting and friendly he was with me on the show. It was really cool. It felt like I was catching up with an old friend. One of his tips that I took away was he talked about creating color palettes and finding colors that work perfectly together. And then in his words, he just goes grab bag and pulls out like a booger green and adds that to his beautiful color palette. And it's amazing how all those things work together. But one of his habits, so within all of his craziness of answering email and having client calls and working on deadlines, every Sunday, Tad gets up early and creates a project that he calls the Sunday Suns. And it's maybe just what it sounds like. So he will either draw or sketch or illustrate or paint something with a sun on it, and he'll post it on social media. When I spoke with him in 2016, he was about 40 some of these Sunday Suns in, and now he's up to, I think, about 150. So this has been going on for about 3 years. But for him, this is a personal way that he can grow and learn new things as a designer and really just have time to play. Finding inspiration. This secret number 8, water what you water grows, did not come directly from the episode, but I found it later in some of her lettering work. This is Lauren Hom from Hom Sweet Hom. I love a good pun anyhow. She was in Bali when I interviewed her, and you can literally hear the crickets and the geckos and the roosters in Bali. That was like 4 a.m. her time that she got up to Skype with me to record this episode. What she said was traveling the world wasn't something she necessarily intended to do, but she had been several months into her journey when I talked to her, and she thought, people might look at this and think, well, you must just have a ton of money and you're just kind of flaunting it and running around. But she's like, I'm actually saving money compared to my life previously in New York and in San Francisco. And she said, when she goes to these exotic locations, she's able to have regular work days, and she goes heads down when she's got a deadline and might work for 5 or 6 days straight. And then when she doesn't have a project to do, she treats it like vacation for a couple of days. And then as soon as she gets a new deadline, she's back to work. So I think creating that kind of situation for yourself is a great way to experience a cool remote working situation. What are your proudest moments? What's something you're most proud of as a designer? Secret number 9 is even Snoop Dogg knows good design. So this next designer, James Connolly, is a set designer, and he's done stuff for The Voice and for corporate office environments. But he got tasked as a last-minute replacement to design a set for a cooking show for Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg called Potluck Dinner. I think there's a pun in the potluck portion of that show. So he said there is nothing more rewarding than looking at how to create this seemingly unsolvable problem. How do you create a set that is both going to work for Martha Stewart and for Snoop Dogg? And the thing that really inspired him as the central thing was an herb garden in the middle. So when Martha and Snoop first came to see this thing in person, he said he not only got a first-person tour with Martha to walk around and let her talk about all the design details that she loved, but he got a giant hug from Snoop Dogg as soon as he saw it. I thought that was pretty amazing. So what have you learned in your career? Secret number 10 is don't compare yourself. If you follow my wife on social media, actually, she will tell you that comparison is the thief of joy. And this is very similar to a lesson that I learned from Danielle Evans. As a designer, she told me she had a challenge with finishing projects. She was trying to do vector illustration like every other vector illustrator. She's like, I would move the little vectors around and I just never get it right. I was looking what everyone else was doing and I thought, I'm never going to get this, until she decided maybe I'm going to try to play with my food. And so she became a food typographer using food and flower petals and all kinds of things to illustrate headlines using food. In her words, she said, I just became comfortable being me. What are some of your favorite things to do as a designer? Secret number 11 is you're never too young to start. And I learned this from the rather young Mark Hirons. He just turned 21. He's in the UK. He's obsessed with football, soccer in our words, and Aaron Draplin. And one of my questions to Mark was, what is creative waffle about? Why did you call it creative waffle? So in the UK, to waffle means to just kind of blabber on about something. It's not about flip-flopping. It has nothing to do with a frozen toaster pastry. It's about chatting about something. Mark is almost 150 episodes into his podcast, and he has interviewed probably just about everybody that I have talked to and then some. And he also launched the series where he goes around and plays the FIFA video game with other design firms and records that on video, and that's on his YouTube channel. This guy's 21 and he has 150 episodes. He's talked to some of the best designers in the world. If he can do this, you guys can do this. What about when you get down? Secret number 12 is fear is a dragon that won't shut up. That's when it's time to slay. This has absolutely nothing to do with Game of Thrones, but this was a good opportunity for me to include a dragon. So Douglas Davis is an author of a book called Creative Strategy and the Business of Design. Fantastic book if you're interested at all in the business side of graphic design. Doug speaks regularly. He teaches. He's been a creative director. He's been an art director. He's not a guy that you would look at and think that he's nervous about speaking. But Doug confessed to me that one of his biggest fears was delivering something that needed to be memorized. So in his words, practice never makes perfect. You're never going to be perfect at anything, but practice makes presentable. So what Doug did was he signed up for a stand-up comedy class, in which the last class was they had to go to a real New York comedy club and deliver their routine. He says that when you find that fear and put yourself in front of those uncomfortable conversations, those uncomfortable situations, that's where growth happens. I can't go an episode without asking someone, so what would you say that you're most obsessed with right now? I had written this question before I had ever interviewed anyone for the show. As part of a theme of Obsessed Show, I wanted to make sure that this obsession with design was part of the conversation that I have with every single guest. Never forget to ask it. So the very first episode that we aired, I got an answer that had nothing to do with design. Secret number 13 is learning to be obsessed with more than just design. Now, this is coming from somebody myself who I like to do all the things. You know, I want to podcast. I want to be able to design. I want to be able to consult. I want to be able to speak. I want to be able to do video. And it's tough to make room for all of that stuff. So when I had a chance to chat with Debbie Millman, who is the OG of design podcasters, like do you guys know that she used to call into a radio station on a phone, and the other person would call in on their phone, and the radio station would record it, and then they would give her the download, and then she would upload the episode of Design Matters to iTunes. She was like, this was like in 2004, I think, is when Design Matters started. And she had to pay the radio station to do this. So when they first invited her, she thought, oh, this is flattering. I get to be on your show. They're like, no, you pay us to be able to do the show. Her answer to what are you most obsessed with right now is, Josh, I'm obsessed with living. And that was such a deep answer to me, especially when I was like, all right, we're kicking off this show. We're going to find out what Debbie's most obsessed with. What nerdy thing is it? And she told me I'm obsessed with living. She said, busy is a decision. I was like, well, how do you do all that stuff? And she just said, I delegate. I have great help and I get great sleep. So it's easy to look at somebody like Debbie and say, man, she just must be killing herself and running all over the place. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think that's the case. Bonus secret, from after Debbie was on my show, she was on Tim Ferriss's show. So obviously I am the stepping stone for how you get to be on the Tim Ferriss show. Sometimes you just got to ask. And secret number 14 is, if you look around this room or literally look next to you, there is probably somebody amazing sitting next to you. And I didn't have a chance today to talk through all of the amazing people from Indianapolis who have been on the Obsessed show, but this is just a quick list of some of the amazing people. You guys have the opportunity later today to actually hear from Bob Ewing and Randy Fisher. So unfortunately, the whole set couldn't be here, but there's some amazing people in Indianapolis. And when I started the show, I kind of intentionally tried to talk to people who weren't in Indy because I was trying to make the audience really broad. But man, it's so easy now to come back to people in Indianapolis because we have some amazing creatives here. And I think Indie Design Week is a great example of that. So what about my advice? Secret number 15, and maybe the best advice that I can give you, is to know your identity. The Amazing Spider-Man, the Spider-Man featuring Andrew Garfield, not Tom Holland, not Tobey Maguire, maybe not the best acted Spider-Man, but one of the last lines of the film, young Peter Parker is going back into high school to sit down for class, and he's a few seconds late. And the acting maybe isn't amazing. But as he sits down, his teacher says, I once had a professor who said there are only 10 plots in all of fiction. But I'm here to tell you today that there is only one. And that plot is, who am I? I don't know why that always gives me the chills, or why I occasionally cry during superhero movies. But I think we as designers, and especially as designers on behalf of our clients, the most valuable thing that we can do for ourselves or for our clients is to define that moment of who am I? What is unique about me? What is unique about my firm? What is unique about my client? And what makes them different? If you do no other thing successfully in marketing or design in this next year, but you nailed this question, this thing will return dividends for years to come. Lastly, secret number 16 is to give thanks. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my guests who've been on the show over the first 3 years. Thank you to all of my guests from Indianapolis. And thank you here for being at Indie Design Week. And thank you for being obsessed with design. I don't believe that we have time for questions after every session today, but I left a few minutes in case you guys wanted to ask any questions. Anybody want to be brave and start? Shout it out. Yes.
The average response when you reach out to a designer, maybe someone who feels like a little out of what you're, a big fish. Do you meet a lot of like, I'm sorry, we can't appear on your show, or is it, do you get a warmer reception than you expect?
Yeah, usually the response, the most common negative response that I get is scheduling related. Like, oh, we're just way too busy. So I think making it easy for them and saying, hey, we try to record Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 5 p.m. Eastern. Do any of these dates work for you? So I've tried to include that as part of the deal. And then some guys just never say yes. So it's helpful to, especially when you know something about that designer and you can connect the dots for them to say, hey, I know you and Tad Carpenter are buds. He was on the show. Here's a link to his episode. We record Tuesdays and Thursdays. Could I interest you in being on the show? That helps them, I think, a little bit more when they have a connection or you can kind of show them the path. What else? I think I saw yes, right here. You heard any kind of a theme that came out that surprised you or you didn't expect before you started on this journey? Yeah, well, I think that Debbie Millman response in particular, and I think the broader thing is these conversations frequently almost feel like therapy for the designer, like where they can kind of unload on something or, not necessarily be upset, but just to kind of share what they're thinking or what they're feeling. And I don't think I expected that to begin with. I was expecting more of like, let's talk about fonts and kerning and favorite Pantone colors. And it really turned into more relationship building and deeper conversation. Yeah.
What would you say, or in what point in your life did you kind of find out who you were as a designer, and like how did that revelation come, if it ever did, if it's still going on?
So 2 parts to that. The second part is I think I'm still figuring it out. The first part is it may have actually been that talk with Michael Beirut where I decided I absolutely want to work in branding. And I was just so impressed and amazed by the work that he was doing and kind of how he talked about it and how common sense it was. That's what got me excited. In the very back?
Yes. Can you speak to any themes as far as like overcoming like obstacles or failures or those pivots? I mean, I know you talked a little bit about like when you're down, but when it's like, oh gosh, this is just not what I expected of either myself or this relationship or how that went, either a personal story for yourself or one that's really memorable about anything.
Yeah, the Danielle Evans episode, the food letterer, I think she goes into a lot of that, a lot of the, self-doubt and things that she was struggling with. And I continue to follow a lot of our guests on social media. From what I've seen, she's dealing with some other different things right now. One that I didn't expect was James White, whose company is Signal Noise. I don't know if there's any Signal Noise friends in here, but he's a solo designer kind of in the middle of nowhere, Canada. And he was dealing with some pretty dark and self-doubt things as well. So it was really interesting to look at his work and how he's just knocking stuff out, doing amazing work minute after minute, and his Instagram feed is just blowing me away. And to know that he's struggling too. So it's easy to look at that Instagram thing and think, man, this designer is just amazing and they must have it all together, when that may not be the case. Yeah.
What's your interaction with the listeners like?
I would say I get the most interaction via the contact form. I love getting interaction through iTunes, getting comments and reviews. I just saw one from this week. I meant to print it out and read it because it was really amazing, and it was cool to hear someone who takes the time. It's not easy to go into iTunes and to sign in, to log in, to find the podcast, to find the comment thing, and take the time to fill it out. It's extra effort, but when I see that, that's pretty great. Twitter is a kind of a main area that I tend to hear back from people, though.
What are you currently obsessed with?
I have a 14-week-old French bulldog who is maybe going on the floor more than we would like, but I still am obsessed with him. His name is Bruce. Time for one more? Yeah.
Danielle Evans, she said comparisons that you fall joy. Where do you find yourself like falling into comparison?
Well, especially as someone who likes to do all the things. Like I spent about a year on YouTube trying to grow that, and it was a ton of work, and it just barely started to sprout. And then I realized I'm not spending any time on the podcast. I need to go back to that. And so spending effort over here and just trying to figure out where to put my effort while you see other people. I mean, Debbie Millman's an amazing example, and there are a million people in between as well to look at and think, why can't I do all of the things? And I think I just keep coming back to, I'm going to have to find things to pare down or hire a staff to run the podcast or something. So all of that right now is me. I had used a company called the Brassy Broadcast Company to edit the podcast for most of the episodes. And the last couple I've been trying to do myself just to keep costs down. But Jen Eds at the Brassy Broadcast Company is fantastic. So if anybody's thinking of a podcast, highly recommend. All right, guys, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Enjoy the rest of Indie Design Week.